Hello, everybody. It's very nice to welcome you all here tonight at Glover Cottages, particularly on such a chilly evening, and to welcome our online audience. You're joining us for an event called Roots of the Sri Lankan Crisis and its Implications for Australia. And our speaker this evening, Dr. Niro Sami, is a lecturer in history at the University of Sydney in the School of Humanities. She teaches international and global studies and in fact specialises in forced migration, international relations, and international activism with a geographical focus. It's great to have you here tonight, Niro. Thank you very much for joining us. Niro will speak to us for around half an hour, and then we'll have half an hour for questions and discussions. For those of us here in the hall, please wait for the microphone. And for those online, you can put your question up using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Over to you, Niro.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose lands on which I'm presenting to you from. Thank you to Ian and to the Australian Institute of International Affairs for having me here today to talk about the Sri Lankan crisis. Images of long queues of people waiting for food, some dying in the process, tuk-tuks lining Goldface, government arrests of protesters who are refusing to stay silent, as well as stories of families going without meals and children missing out on school, have all now come to define the world's views of Sri Lanka and the crisis that it is facing. Pointing to the economic, social, and political manifestations of the crisis, Amnesty International has urged authorities to uphold human rights to freedom of movement, liberty and security of people, noting that Sri Lanka has ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and has an obligation both individually and through international assistance and cooperation to guarantee economic and social rights to its people. These include people's rights to health, education, social security, adequate food, and an adequate standard of living. But this seems a long stretch, given that the island is now bankrupt. While the new president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, has taken it upon himself to crack down on political dissent, while failing to secure critical and crucial IMF bailout packages. As a historian, I'm less interested in drawing conclusions about the crisis based on what we've been witnessing this year, and more interested in situating the crisis in the island's longer history of political ruptures driven by a confluence of domestic and international factors and poor political leadership, such as the free market liberal policies of the 1970s under Jayawardena, the growing significance of Sri Lanka to new geopolitical orders in the Indian Ocean during the Cold War, and the almost 3 decades long war that is the source of the Tamil refugee exodus. I point to these and other examples from the past and suggest that the current crisis is a symptom of a country that has historically experienced various states of crisis in ebbs and flows, affecting some communities more than others at certain moments in time. At the core of these histories is the relentless power of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism that guides all of Sri Lankan political life and has ultimately pushed the country and its people onto their knees. And therefore, I suggest that the country needs to reckon with its political stability alongside addressing the economic crisis. The longer history of an island nation in crisis, I suggest, can actually help us understand how we got here and perhaps indicate what needs to change in order to overcome its perpetual state of crisis. I'll structure my talk by identifying key features of the crisis and then locate these within longer 20th and 21st century Sri Lankan histories. And you'll see that on the slide here. So I'll be talking about Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism and its historical roots, the economic crisis, international relations, militarization, and asylum seekers, which seems to be the biggest topic or talking point here in Australia for us at the moment. My first point is about Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism. In November 2019, during the presidential elections, Gotabaya Rajapaksa ran on a strong nationalist campaign and made renewed appeals to Sinhala Buddhist nationalism to protect Sri Lankans, he said. He has also used this nationalist rhetoric to justify Sri Lanka's pivot towards China. And when Ranil Wickremesinghe was sworn in as the new president, he vowed to uphold constitutional values that gives Buddhism a foremost place and accordingly to protect the Buddhist philosophy. Sri Lankan leaders have repeatedly used Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism to appeal to the moral views of Sinhalese voters, the majority, while corrupting the country and failing to deliver election promises. The influence of Buddhism on politics came to bearing, perhaps most significantly, early on during the 1956 elections in ways that laid the foundations for an ethnocratic state, the one that we see in action now. The SLFP was challenging the UNP. It was also the first election that saw a coalition of forces rallying as Sinhalese Buddhists. They included monks, teachers, farmers, labourers, and physicians. Bandaranaike, who was running in the elections, and his SLFP party realised they could use a Sinhala-only platform to outdo the UNP, and soon campaigned on the slogan Sinhala only in 24 hours. The push towards institutionalising Sinhala Buddhist nationalism into policy was driven by numerous reasons, including Britain's divide and rule policies that favoured the Tamil minority, the subsequent Tamil overrepresentation in civil service, armed forces, universities, and professional bodies. And when Bandaranaike became the leader of this movement, he pushed for a Sinhala-only policy. Notable here as well is the role of Buddhist monks, whose engagement with politics ensured that Bandaranaike implemented the Sinhala-only policy when he came into power. Within months of the new policy, anti-Tamil riots precipitated antagonism between the Tamils and Sinhalese. Even when the Tamils negotiated Tamil language to be used in administrative matters, the Buddhist clergy protested and argued that it would be and I quote here, a betrayal of Sinhalese Buddhist people. More anti-Tamil riots took place in 1958, 1977, and of course in 1983. But by making Sinhalese the official language of the island, Tamil speakers were forced out of key employment sectors. So one of the biggest outcomes of the 1956 elections was that under Bandaranaike, the state became instrumental for uplifting the peasantry and working class Sinhalese. Not only did the 1956 Sinhala Only Act pave the way for making Sinhalese the official language, but it gave permission for successive governments to continue enshrining similar policies of racial discrimination, creating antagonism between the two ethnic communities to reinforce Sinhala Buddhist nationalism as the overarching ethos of Sri Lankan governance. Now, following these 1956 elections, Bandaranaike implemented a range of populist economic policies, making the state an active player in the economy. This included a state monopoly over strategic industries and related expansion of the public sector and expanded welfare programs. There were restrictions on foreign investment, the nationalisation of critical industries, as well as land reform measures that nationalised plantations and redistributed land to working class Sinhalese populations. Ultimately, these were economically unfeasible schemes, but they also began to cement ethnic divisions in the island. So in a lot of ways, the 1956 elections were an early example of how the economy suffered, minorities suffered, and Buddhism became entrenched in state discourse. So the significance here of these elections cannot be understated. The tragedy of these elections lies in the fact that it set the country on a path of empowering extremist leaders through the ideology of this nationalism at the expense of the social, cultural, and economic stability of all groups on the island. Now, successive governments have singularly focused on creating better conditions for all Sinhalese social classes. Not only the Sinhala Only Act in 1956, but several other initiatives come to mind that were materially and symbolically important for Sinhalese people at the expense of other minority groups on the island. For instance, standardization policies, which gave admission to universities in the early 1970s, favored primarily Sinhalese middle classes. The expansion of the public sector created opportunities primarily for Sinhalese working classes. Extensive welfare sector created opportunities primarily for the Sinhalese working classes. which is quite interesting to note because it also had flow-on effects to other parts of the economy. One other notable feature was the expansion of patronage on access to resources rather than patronage based on personal wealth. With this, political competition became more open to new people, and gaining political power required carefully integrating both political patronage, client networks, and state institutions. And this patronage has been dependent on general economic conditions, while import substitutions have been constrained by saturation of the domestic market and lack of competitiveness in the export market. So what we started to see here, and you can see on this table, is that Sri Lankan governments have historically struggled to keep their campaign promises to capture the votes of the Sinhalese middle and lower classes, which have been the kind of bulk of their political campaigns. It has therefore meant that both major parties, the UNP and the SLFP, when they were in opposition, campaigned on these strong nationalist critiques of the government and a promise to restore socialist values. In this table here on this slide, in the black highlighted figures, we can see that every election since then has been mainly dominated by these major groups or major parties. This political hegemony of Sinhalese class alliances and internal rivalry between competing Sinhalese political networks have been the immediate driving forces behind Sinhalese nationalism and state chauvinism, which not only resulted in poor economic reform during this period, but has driven a wedge between ethnic communities. My second point is about the economic crisis itself. While the times are different now, with much higher needs for electricity, more households with vehicles that require fuel and gas cylinders for cooking, with the evident point that fuel is critical to the functioning of everyday life, the 1970s were also a period of severe economic hardships due to poor economic policies. Under Bandaranaike, in the period between 1970 to 1977, the SLFP party made significant changes to the economy that produced a situation eerily similar to what we're seeing today in Sri Lanka. Land reforms meant that the state had taken over the acquisition of privately owned tea and rubber plantations. Some of these lands were given to supporters of certain political parties for them to build houses. Consequently, production in plantation declined and many became economically unviable. Import substitution continued, so imported goods, including food items, were often in short supply. People queued in line for hours to get basic food items like bread and rice. And the Bandaranaike government also quelled the first youth uprising by the JBP, the Marxist-Leninist Communist Party, and promised new reform measures to address issues faced by educated but unemployed youth. But it wasn't only the Sinhalese youth and working classes who were affected by these socialist reforms. In 1972, the government introduced a constitution that again bolstered Buddhism with more power in legislature, and more importantly, eradicated Section 29 of the Salisbury Constitution, an article that gave protection to ethnic minorities against racial discrimination. In this context, policies like standardization, which came into play, were implemented, disproportionately affecting Tamil students. As historian Nira Wickramasinghe notes, and I quote here from her work, the implicit purpose of these policies was to address the alienation of the educated Sinhalese youth by neutralizing the superior performance of Tamil medium students in science subjects. The political, economic, and social situation did not fare better when Jayawardena campaigned at the presidential elections in 1977. He campaigned on a platform to strengthen Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism, restore the economy, including removing the import substitution economic policies that Bandaranaike had implemented. He won the 1977 presidential elections, which saw the UNP come to power. Whereas the 1956 to 1977 period was characterized by a development program of democratic socialism, the new UNP government embarked on an economic liberalization program. Jayawardena shifted the country on a path of export-oriented industrialization. He eliminated restrictions on imports, removed price controls, and introduced food stamps, schemes targeting working class families. But many of the liberalization policies meant an end of the general concessions that held the ethnic class alliances together. The change of economic policy had adverse impacts on those groups that were particularly dependent on general state protection and welfare transfers, that is, peasants, small industrialists, public sector workers, and the urban and rural poor. Some scholars have argued that there is a direct causal link between social impacts of economic liberalization on these groups and the increased anti-Tamil violence, which in turn triggered the war between the Sinhalese dominant state and Tamil separatist movements from the late 1970s until 2009, when the war ended. Beyond these liberal economic reforms, Jayawardenepudi in 1978 amended the constitution and declared himself the executive president of Sri Lanka. The Prime Minister became the nominal head of the parliamentary team, and his powers were drastically reduced. The change to a French-style executive presidency meant that the president chaired the cabinet and made all cabinet appointments. One thing to note is that even when the people were asked to vote on a referendum, asking for people's vote to extend the life of a parliament by another term, the state used its powers in some areas to curtail free and fair participation of voters in the elections, trends that we continue to see in successive elections. Not only did the free market programs result in fierce opposition from political parties such as the JVP, Jayawardenepudi also fanned ethnic tensions, resulting in the emergence, as I said, of multiple Tamil separatist groups in the north of the island. There were specific impacts for Tamils in the north, for whom the post-1977 period brought about significant reductions in their access to employment and education. The point is that the economic policies had failed to address the social needs of people, leaving the society in a state of further inequality and ruins. Importantly, free market policies had ensured that political and economic supremacy was granted to a small, powerful segment of the country, while violently excluding the Tamils, Muslims, and segments of the working class Sinhalese, although it was clear that nationalist projects included all Sinhalese in blanket terms. So in fact, the Rajapaksa government mismanaging the economy mirrors these poor economic policies of Jayawardenepudi during the 1970s, when the country faced an economic crisis. So many of the paradigms and rhetoric that we're seeing about international relations, especially those related to aid, are a reminder that the Sri Lankan government has always struggled to assert itself on the international stage during times of crisis. In recent weeks, the Sri Lankan government has swayed towards India and away from China. Earlier this month, the Sri Lankan Foreign Ministry told the Chinese embassy in Colombo to not go ahead with the Chinese visit by ship, with experts suggesting that Sri Lanka was responding to India's concerns about China entering Sri Lankan waters. Historically, Sri Lanka has always been an international player, and during Jayawardene's government, it was better disposed than his predecessors towards the West. Jayawardene's actions in liberalizing the Sri Lankan economy shifted the government close to the West. There was increased aid donations from the US, and the 14th Sri Lanka Aid Group meeting in Paris, which included Sri Lanka, Japan, and Britain, pledged an unprecedented 6 million rupees for Sri Lanka's development program. So there's always been that kind of engagement on the international stage, mostly for aid. And I mention this because the 1970s also saw a growing bilateral relationship between Australia and Sri Lanka. Oceanic geopolitics gives us some insight into how Sri Lanka and Australia have engaged with each other in the recent past. The Indian Ocean Zone of Peace, for instance, which was tabled by Bandaranaike in 1971 at the United Nations, was one of these initiatives that demonstrated growing and strong bilateral relations between Australia and Sri Lanka based on securitizing the ocean. This was, of course, against the backdrop of Cold War politics. Australian economic interests in Sri Lanka had expanded considerably during the 1980s through trade missions and investment interests from business magnates. Australian relations with Sri Lanka were further bolstered by social and cultural exchanges, including an Aboriginal art exhibition, for instance, that was held in Colombo and was very well received. Encouraged by the Sri Lankan government, it was oil actually that lured Australia and sent the rest of the world on the hunt for oil off the coast of Sri Lanka. The US, for instance, had injected $12 million into the search off the northwest coast of Sri Lanka. The Soviet Union was digging for oil in Mannad, a Tamil area that was showing increasing signs of political unrest that threatened the Sri Lankan state's desire to remain a unitary state. To what degree then were Australia's diplomatic initiatives effective in sustaining relations with smaller island states in the Indian Ocean, such as Sri Lanka, which were outwardly advocating a non-aligned movement? While Australia's diplomatic initiatives with Sri Lanka were successful, I would say, in striking a balance and pursuing its traditional middle power duties in international relations. The Indian Ocean peace movement provided a key opportunity for Australia to mediate these Cold War tensions while forging intense diplomacy with Sri Lanka, which in turn aimed to promote its multilateral cooperation for preventing conflict in the Indian Ocean. It's this kind of bilateral relationship that helps us understand the relationship between the two countries today. However, as an underdeveloped country that relied heavily on overseas exports and aid, Sri Lanka's goal of suppressing an increasingly militarized Indian Ocean was impossible to achieve. Instead, Sri Lanka sought to use its role in Indian Ocean peace initiatives to secure its international status on these international matters and turned Australia on key occasions to act more successfully in concert with like-minded powers. In some ways, this alliance between a middle power and a country ambitious for any meaningful international standing could not have resulted in a different outcome. So during this period of the late 1970s and early 1980s, there were significant changes in international relations between countries like Australia, Sri Lanka, and India. And I'd be happy to field more questions about this during question time. My next point is about how the Sri Lankan government, both Gotabaya and Wickremesinghe, in the last few months have been asking the military to shoot protesters. The rapid deployment of military to quell civilian protesters is nothing new, as militarization is historically a central pillar of Sri Lankan governance. The Ministry of Defence received 12.3% of the total estimated government expenditure in 2022, the highest allocation for any ministry in the budget. This is despite the war ending 13 years ago. Since the war ended in 2009, the Tamil population in the north and east of the island face the brunt of this militarization, which encroaches on their everyday lives. The military in the north and east runs civilian life from schools to recreation and religious activities. There is an estimated 1 military personnel for every 6 civilians. The intensity of the military in these regions can be seen on the map on the slide. Probably not too clearly, but you can see military presence dotted along the north and east, a lot more than they are dotted in other parts of the country. Of the 20 defence military divisions, 16 are located in the north and east. Out of the 6 defence headquarters, 4 are located in the north and east. We might have all heard of war tourism, where war sites have been converted to tourist spots along the A9, for instance, that connects the south to the north. But the military operates in more insidious ways through the tourism industry itself. One of these is a Thalsavenna Army Resort, which is located in a high security zone, places that the army have used to set up their own operations and severely curtail the local population's ability to rebuild houses and livelihoods. At this particular resort, the army runs a luxury resort along the Kangesinthura beach in Jaffna. The area was under military control during the war, and since the war ended, has been turned into a holiday resort. The Tamils who once lived in the area aren't able to return there, effectively living in a state of perpetual displacement. In 2020, Gotabaya established a presidential task force to build a secure country, disciplined, virtuous, and lawful society. He further noted that the security of a country is a key factor in establishing economic strategies aimed at the development of a country and which emphasizes the equal protection of the law for the well-being of the people and for building a civilized society. Now, what I want to note here is that members of this presidential task force have been implicated in war crimes, people like Shavendra Silva, for whom the US has imposed sanctions on because of credible information of his involvement in human rights violations during the war. What the presidential task force has actually done is given permission to the security forces to arrest human rights activists, advocates, protesters, and civil society groups. Similarly, Wickremesinghe has given orders to the military to quell civilian protesters, a move that reinforces Sri Lanka as a militarized state. So how does Australia respond to and work with Sri Lanka through its foreign policy? In March of 2021, Australia backed a UK-led resolution at the UN Human Rights Council that expressed deep concern at the deteriorating situation in Sri Lanka. The resolution noted the accelerating militarization of civilian government functions and the erosion of the independence of the judiciary and the increased marginalization of Tamil and Muslim communities. However, just a month later, the Australian government gave Sri Lanka's police force 5 aerial surveillance drones. The drones were previously owned by the Operation Sovereign's Border Joint Agency Task Force, part of Australia's military-led border security operation, whose primary responsibility was to deter and disrupt asylum seekers trying to reach Australia. Australia claimed that the drones will be used to support crime-fighting activities. I've argued elsewhere that Australia needs to reconsider how it supports its Indian Ocean neighbour. As Foreign Affairs Minister Penny Wong said on 20th of June this year, and I quote, "Not only do we want to help the people of Sri Lanka in its time of need, there are also deeper consequences for the region if this crisis continues." Australia's priorities are quite different from the concerns of ordinary Sri Lankans. A new fisheries monitoring centre jointly launched by the Australian and Sri Lankan governments will install tracking devices on more than 4,000 Sri Lankan fishing vessels, which can be used in the early identification of irregular vessel movements. So in fact, Australia's priority is supporting Sri Lanka's efforts to strengthen its border management capacity. And that's according to a statement from the Australian High Commissioner in Colombo. These are some of the poorest and most persecuted people who are fleeing the country by boat. They're fleeing places like Baunia, Kilinochchi, Mullaitivu, Trincomalee, and other Tamil majority areas that have been ravaged by the war. In recent weeks, people escaping Sri Lanka by boat have been intercepted at sea by Australian authorities and returned without adequate assessments of their asylum claims. The UNHCR has previously said that Australia's enhanced assessments, which don't properly consider individuals' needs for protection, and I quote here, potentially place Australia in breach of its obligations under the Refugee Convention and other international law obligations. The federal opposition also claimed during this time that boats were arriving in Australia because of the changing government. But actually, people have been fleeing to other destinations as well, notably to Tamil Nadu. My final point is actually on this very topic of asylum seekers by boat. And I argue this point in my chapter in this book, which is a fantastic book, by the way, if you haven't purchased it. And I think it's important to think about how the Australian government has historically responded to asylum seekers fleeing war and persecution in Sri Lanka as a way to think about how to respond to the arrival of asylum seekers today. And so I want to conclude my talk just quickly, very briefly, about an instance of time where the Australian government responded differently. I want to stress that this is a refugee protection crisis that relates to not only asylum seekers fleeing Sri Lanka, but the some 2.5 million people who are also fleeing from places like Ukraine, and another 2 million people who continue to be displaced. As historian Peter Gattrell in his recent op-ed for the New York Times reminds us, this situation, however bleak, is not without precedents. Taking this up in Australia, our government has responded to people fleeing Sri Lanka before in somewhat different ways. So if the Australian government is to respond appropriately to the arrival of asylum seekers from Sri Lanka, it may want to consider involving communities in this process, just as it did once in the early 1980s at the onset of the war. There are currently no provisions for citizens of those communities fleeing to be actively involved in policies that directly affect their families and communities and others in their country of origin. This failure to consult people with the on-ground experience partly explains Australia's punitive approaches to refugees, an approach that attracts international criticism and condemnation. Historical responses to Tamil refugees fleeing Sri Lanka tells us that policymakers benefit greatly from working with communities most affected by the crisis. From the late 1970s to the early 1980s, the government then, at least in part, had clear pragmatic processes in place to guide its engagement with Tamil citizens. The government consideration of options for refugee resettlement put an emphasis on developing services that were suited to the particular needs of that community, including establishing direct lines of communication between immigration officers and Tamil community leaders. This was possible because the government called on the knowledge of Tamils who had already arrived in Australia. In seeking to reform our desperately inadequate refugee resettlement services, today's policymakers can draw inspiration from the actions of the Fraser and Hawke governments in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Taking a look at past responses to refugees, we find context for radically different ways of responding to the current protection crisis. Shortly after the anti-Tamil riots in July 1983, the Hawke Labor government processed Tamil people's applications inside Sri Lanka under the Special Humanitarian Program. This was a program that was established to allow those who are not eligible for normal migration entry or family reunion to be considered entry into Australia. That the SHP was implemented specifically for the Sri Lankan situation was an instrumental outcome of discussions between policymakers and Tamil refugee advocates. It's the only instance of Tamil perspectives being taken into serious consideration by the Australian government on Tamil refugee matters. Organisations like the Ceylon Tamil Association, just like other ethno-specific organisations, were crucial to addressing the immediate resettlement needs of refugees. By addressing gaps in government-run services, the CTA provided newly arrived Tamil refugees with furniture, translation services, access to housing, and so on. Why was connecting with politicians significant? Well, it had enabled the CTA to connect with politicians through direct meetings, which in turn was an important precondition for their involvement in developing adequate policy responses to Tamils fleeing persecution. One of the association's founding members explained to me that meetings with key federal politicians such as Stuart West, Minister for Immigration and Ethnic Affairs at that time, were actually quite formative in the implementation of the SHP. Today, it's almost impossible for Tamil refugee advocates to support newly arrived Tamil asylum seekers due to policies that prevent them from resettling or prolong their time on temporary protection visas, preventing them from accessing basic welfare supports. But actually what we're seeing is that those people aren't actually able even to arrive into Australia because they're being deported. Unsurprisingly, international experts avoid using Australia's refugee policy as a model for how to address the current global refugee protection crisis today. The experience of Tamils fleeing Sri Lanka at the outbreak of the war, however, shows that listening and engaging with communities most affected by the crisis is actually crucial to developing sound policies. Put simply, such inclusive policymaking helps to address refugee protection crises. In this case, viewing Tamils not as problems, but as part of diaspora communities with longer histories of migration. By focusing on these historical agents, I suggest we bring to relief experiences from past crises that can help address the current one. As we watch difficult scenes of people struggling in Sri Lanka, some resorting to fleeing, we are witnessing an outpouring of support from diaspora communities, Tamil, Muslim, and Sinhalese communities. At the same time, we are also witnessing government hostility towards those fleeing by boat. Asylum seekers face the violent wrath of government authorities when they are deported to Sri Lanka. It is possible to return to the past, as I have just done, to look for clues about how to not only understand the present, but to consider radical instances of transformation and changes that have brought us here, and to offer ways to push for better politicians, political systems, and humane approaches to those in need. These histories, I suggest, are all the more important if Sri Lanka is to turn a new leaf. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Kandasamy. I'd now like to hand the floor over to our audience, both here and online, for questions. Anything online at this point? Let's start with an online question.
Yes, we do have one online. Our first questioner asks, do you think the UN Human Rights Council session in September will make a difference? And what do you think Australia's position should be in the lead up to it, especially as Australia is no longer a member of the Council?
I think what's really important in terms of the UN's role is that it has repeatedly called on the Sri Lankan government to address the needs of all groups on the island. So I think it will be important for stressing those long-standing needs that need to be addressed, but also recognizing that Sri Lanka is in, it's in a very different situation now in terms of the pressing economic crisis. And I think what we'll probably see is a lot of intensified criticism of the government and certain politicians. So that kind of accountability is going to be a focal point for the UN. So in that sense, I do see it as a critical moment.
Thanks. Can I just make a quick comment before I ask you a question? Do you have any hopes that our immigration policy for Sri Lanka or any third world country, I think, is rather hopeless and daunting? Even if it's a change of government, they are still sending people back. But if you are white, it's a complete issue. Look at the way they treat the Ukrainians. Okay. Having said that, how much debt are there from the Chinese? There's a lot of articles saying that look, all this Chinese debts that has created the extra problems. But I can understand, given that now China's geopolitical interests, they won't let any Chinese whatever boat into the country. What about this Hambata, the port, remember, owing to the Chinese? Are there a continuation of owing them, or are they involving with any further new projects?
Yeah, I think it's a great comment and question. I think the question about China's role in Sri Lanka has received a lot of media attention, understandably, given the geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in. I think what's important to note, firstly, is that the amount of debt that Sri Lanka has to China is roughly about the same as countries like Japan, right? Yeah, it's around 10%, that's right. And I think in terms of how the Sri Lankan government is going to respond to those debts, well, in terms of the port itself, it's on a 99-year lease or something. So I think we'll probably see a restructuring of that debt more than anything. I don't think it will actually amount to a reduction of that debt. And I think that'll depend on how the Sri Lankan government decides to, restructure its economy in light of the current crisis. But I don't see that debt, going away anytime soon, is what I'm saying. Not only with China, but to other countries like India and Japan.
So are they barring any new help or any investment from the Chinese and looking to the IMF?
Yeah, so at the moment, those IMF bailout packages are pending. I think Wickremesinghe is currently in talks with the IMF to secure those bailout packages, but that's all dependent on whether or not the government is able to implement sound economic policies. So, all of that is sort of, in the works. We'll see if Wickremesinghe is successful in securing those IMF bailout packages. But you're right, I think at the moment, the IMF is probably going to be quite crucial to restoring the Sri Lankan economy, if it is successful.
You referred to Sri Lanka earlier on in your speech as the island, as opposed to, say, the country, which is the more common, much more common in the mainstream media. What kind of nation-state structure do you think is most favorable to political and economic stability in the island, and why?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Look, I think there needs to be deep structural reform at the level of the nation state, some kind of a federal approach that gives the minorities on the islands equal say in political matters, because at the moment that's not happening. So in every election, we're seeing, the majority of voters, whether Sinhalese, having quite a strong part to play in the political outcomes of the country. So I'd like to see a restructuring of the nation state that takes into account the political aspirations of minority Tamil Muslim communities.
The federal structure or more than one nation state?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Look, I think as a historian, it's important to recognize that Sri Lanka was not a unitary state. The British came into Sri Lanka and unified the state. And a lot of the problems that we've seen post-colonialism have been a result of that unification. So my point, I think, is that we should consider separate state solutions, because the Tamils have been calling for a separate state for a very long time. And I think their needs and political aspirations have been continuously overshadowed, undermined, and rejected by not only the Sri Lankan state, but also international states as well.
That's a fascinating perspective. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you. I've got two questions. One is about culture and one's about trade. To start with the one about culture, Tamil culture has got a very long history and a very long literature and many cultural forms such as music and dance and so on. And there is, can you tell us something about how that is recognized internationally, for instance, with the United Nations? And are there international efforts being made to preserve Tamil culture in what is obviously a difficult domestic situation in Sri Lanka? That's my question about culture. Well, actually related to that is trade, because I think you referred to, it's interesting that the debate about the structure of the Sri Lankan economy goes back to the 1970s, where the government support was put behind export industries at the expense of local self-sustaining agriculture. Well, I would welcome that because I'm totally addicted to Sri Lankan tea or Ceylon tea. I drink it every day, and I think it's an important part of global culture, tea culture. But I'm just wondering, what is the place in the future for trade in those basic economies which were listed in that policy document of the 1970s, chiefly rubber and tea? What's the future for Sri Lankan export trade? What measures should be taken to diversify? For instance, I see that not very far to the north in South India, there is now a very lively services export industry with many highly qualified people in the IT and other industries. Are these being encouraged and developed in Sri Lanka, or does it all depend on me drinking more tea?
Great question. So in terms of the first question, I think, Tamils in Sri Lanka have a long history with Tamils in South India, right? So we share historically the same language, culture, traditions, and so on. In terms of, so there is that kind of bondage, if you will, with that community there that you can see in all sorts of places in the global sphere, from the United Nations to, migrant communities. I think what's really driving the culture and sustaining the cultural Tamil communities specifically in Sri Lanka is the diaspora. So the diaspora is the main source of, if you will, transporting that culture to different parts of the world. And that's done through community events, it's done through any kind of engagement with local governments. And it's really done, with the proliferation of technologies through now social media as well. So I would say the diaspora are the main conduits of Tamil culture from Sri Lanka. In terms of the UN, I'm not aware of any Tamil specific initiatives taken by the UN. But yeah, so I would say the diaspora would be they're the main drivers of Tamil culture in Sri Lanka. And in terms of trade, look, I think it's a tricky one. I think rubber, tea have always been, as I said, historically the main kind of export industries for Sri Lanka. It's perhaps one of the reasons why the economic crisis has unfolded in the way that it has, because it's such a kind of a narrow group of commodities that have been exported. I think in recent years, we've seen the government invest a lot of money into tourism. And that is one area that I see where potentially the government could expand. But again, if the tourism is tied to military running, and colonizing various parts of the land in north and east, what does that say, right? So I think it's important for us to take, an ethical approach to thinking about exporting and what kind of exports the Sri Lankan government decides to invest in. I think there's also opportunities for agriculture some of those lands in the north and east that the military have colonized could be used to develop the local economy, to allow those people who have been displaced by war to return to their lands and undertake agricultural practices. So there is potential there. I think there are a lot of blockages from the government that might be preventing that. But again, it'll be interesting to see what the new government has in terms of long-term plans for the economy.
Could you tell us a bit more about tea production? Because tea is one of those commodities where
whether in the past, particularly in India, there's been some virtual slavery conditions on tea plantations. So as people become more conscious of the need to enforce ethical standards in commodity trade, what is the situation regarding the tea industry in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, I think historically it's been similarly exploitative. These are Tamils who were brought over by the British and forced to work extended hours on tea plantations. I think there have been several, initiatives to improve the conditions on tea plantations. But again, there are still vast amounts of people who are working under those incredibly difficult labor conditions. I think in light of the current economic crisis, with the shutdown of those plantations, you can imagine the kind of impacts that would have, or that it could trickle down onto the people who have been working there. I think it's been a major source of export for Sri Lanka, but it's also been a major source of challenge for ensuring that, especially for human rights activists, who, to ensure that those people are not exploited for their labor.
Two more questions in the hall, and then we got something. First of all, John.
Thank you. I found it a very interesting talk. I've got a really number of questions, and some have already been answered. But to start with, it is a country that seems to have been ruled by a set of dynasties. And I remember well as a child hearing about the Bandaranaike assassination, a dynasty that was promptly taken over by the lady in the household. Is it still going to be dominated by a set of political dynasties? That's one thing. The second thing I remember very well, Lee Kuan Yew saying that about Singapore in the 60s, he hoped one day it would be able to follow in the wake of Ceylon, as it then was. What sort of economic policies do you think could be expected, would be needed and expected, which are slightly two different things, to restore some sort of level of restoration of middle class, middle income classification? And thirdly, one gathers that the crisis that's been going through has led to to everybody coming together. So there's been a sort of unification. How long do you think that'll last? I mean, will the Sinhalese nationalism recognize that they need to compromise?
Yeah, great questions. In terms of the question about political dynasties, look, I think it's difficult to say. I think history tells us that, as you suggested, Sri Lanka has been governed by political dynasties. We still see members of the Rajapaksa government family in politics currently. And so I think, there are still indications that political dynasties will continue, especially because we're also seeing the same political leaders become influential people in parliament. So for example, Ranil Wickremesinghe has been a part of Sri Lankan government for decades now. So until we see, a real kind of new fresh wave of political leaders who are not attached to some historical family who have been in politics, I think there's every chance that we'll continue to see dynasties run Sri Lankan government. In terms of economic policies that are needed, yeah, again, I think that's a really tough question to answer. I would say an expansion of export industries could be an instance where...
I should say that I've worked with a group that uses the IT and accounting capacities.
Yeah. Yeah.
very successful.
Yeah, that's right. So, you know, thinking about expanding some of those industries that have plummeted, mobilizing them in the same way that, for example, India has. So the IT industry is one that has resulted in a massive boom for the Indian economy. And I think Sri Lanka has every opportunity to do something similar. So really tapping into some of those underutilized resources to help, especially, you know, young people, the next generation, because this crisis is affecting, you know, a generation of people who are not seeing a future in the country and who are now looking for opportunities to migrate elsewhere. So I think there's a real need for the government to tap into some of those, you know, to some of the needs of this next generation and to identify some sectors that, you know, could very well speak to some of their aspirations, whether that be IT or engineering or commerce. In terms of protesters, yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, partly because it wasn't actually up until recently that the media started to recognize globally that this was a protest that had involved the South, the majority Sinhalese, and in a lot of ways had only just started to recognize that Tamils in the North had been protesting, not just in relation to the economic crisis now, but have been protesting for quite a long time since the war had ended.
I mean, will the military give up its stranglehold on economic activity?
I think that'll depend on the government because the military is so deeply entwined with the government. You know, there are members of the military who are part of the government. So until there's a reckoning with the politics, I don't think the military will remove themselves from the North and East. And you saw the map that I showed on the slide there, how, you know, how heavily they've infiltrated the North and East. This is, you know, despite the war having ended 13 years ago. So look, I think a lot of it is going to be dependent on the people and whether or not the people want to include some of these long-standing demands of, you know, the minorities on the island. So yeah, I would say,
will the elite listen to the people?
well, sorry?
Will the elite listen?
Well, that's the $1 million question, I think, for all of us. I think, you know, what the protesters have actually shown is that they are capable of toppling a government, right? There is potential there for reform. They've just removed Gotabaya Rajapaksa, so there's every opportunity there to make the country look different to what it has historically looked like. It's a matter of whether or not they want to.
This is turning into quite a dialogue. Recently, there's been an enormous amount of tidal wave of antagonism towards China. Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan has encouraged war games around Taiwan from China. And one of the outgrowths of this anti-Chinese feeling we have in Australia is that the Belt and Road system that the Chinese have instituted is simply a way of economic colonialism. Now, in the countries to which they're giving great amounts of money and there are lots of projects and so on. Now, you said earlier that I think I got it right when I heard you say the Sri Lankans generally, the government, possibly the people, are a bit wary about China. And I'd like you to expand on that a little bit. Is China doing the same sorts of things that Australians fear they're doing in many other countries around the Indian Ocean and in Africa? Is Sri Lanka going to be a satrap of China because of economic dependency? Is the IMF able to restructure debts? Or is Sri Lanka looking elsewhere and not allowing themselves to be trapped in this debt trap?
I think it's a little bit late for Sri Lanka to detach themselves from China. I think that, you know, under Mahinda Rajapaksa, for example, a lot of the funding to end the war came from China, right? So there's a lot of I think, tension there about the influence and the impact that China has had on the country as well. There were major projects that the Chinese government has funded in Sri Lanka. Road projects, buildings, high-rise complexes and so on. So a lot of the infrastructure that we saw in the post-war period has actually been funded by the Chinese government. So I think there's that tension there, right? There's that tension there between the role that it has had in the country and the debts that Sri Lanka has towards China, as I said earlier, make it extremely difficult, I think, for the Sri Lankan government to completely remove themselves from China, regardless of what India, for example, would want, or other Western powers would want. I think what it also shows us is that Chinese government funding in Sri Lanka also precipitated the corruption that we saw with the Mahinda Rajapaksa family. Right? So a lot of the corruption that we're seeing come out of news stories at the moment tied to the Rajapaksa family also are connected to the money given by the Chinese government. I think there's a lot of unpacking there to do about the role of China, that it is quite integrated into Sri Lankan governance.
And are the Chinese anti-tenant?
Well, if we go by what happened during the war, then I would say yes.
Thank you. I think we have time to just have one more question on the.
We've got quite a few online, but since we've only got the time for the one, I might take this as the last one. How can the Sri Lankan diaspora contribute towards the rebuilding of Sri Lanka, recognizing there's to be an overhaul of the political system?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question. I think there's been an outpouring of support from diaspora communities, whether that be protesting or fundraising. So there is a role to play for the diaspora. I think what will be interesting and what is potentially needed is to see whether the diaspora wants to engage with discussions and critical discussions about the country beyond the economy. So is the diaspora willing to engage with long-standing grievances of minority communities to make sure that whatever reform the Sri Lankan government puts in place is going to address some of those historical needs? Whether or not, in terms of understanding the extent to which that could influence politics in Sri Lanka, that's a different, I think, question. But in terms of the diaspora sparking discussions and engaging with those critical questions around, bringing leaders to accountable for war crimes that are quite important to Tamil communities, then, they're things that the diaspora can do now, right? Yes, this is an economic crisis, but also there are lots of other issues that remain pertinent to all communities on the island, and the diaspora is in an excellent position to be able to have those discussions. It doesn't need the government to do that.
Just a quick rundown of the remaining online questions.
I'll do my best. We've got, there's a couple that are comments, so I can put those to you quickly. The first comment says the idea that the Hambat Tota, apologies, I've definitely mucked up the pronunciation there, the port in Sri Lanka was subject to a Chinese debt trap is a misconception. Repayment of the port wasn't due for a while. The equity deal with China simply raised money for other debt that was due sooner. This was an international sovereign bond. The second comment is that on a separate note, India would not consider a separate state. So is the realpolitik considerations alone on this point a solution based on a principle of devolution of power within a united but not unitary Sri Lanka? There's another question that suggests that whether the crisis within Sri Lanka can be entirely blamed on internal management, how much of it is kind of international related. And I think we've touched on that a fair bit already. And the final comment we had was the recent protest and struggle demonstrated to the majority what minorities must have gone through for many years. Do you think that's a turning point?
I hope so. I sincerely hope so. And I think there's a real opportunity here for not only the communities within Sri Lanka, but also the diaspora communities to reckon with that. So I do hope that this is a turning point for the majority to consider and to address, or to at least help, make a way forward to address those long-standing grievances of the minority communities.
Well, thank you. No easy task to finish such an address on such a positive note. Much appreciated. I'd like just to comment that next week we have what sounds like a pretty challenging topic. It's the role of interests, values, and a rules-based order in formulating Australian foreign policy. And our speaker is the inaugural awardee or recipient of the AIIA China Matters Scholarship, Ms. Yun Zhang. So do tune in or come along next Tuesday for that address. But to conclude our event this evening, Grace Papworth, one of our interns, will move a vote of thanks.
I would first just like to thank you for contextualizing an issue that is very current and clearly has quite a bit of historical weight. I think it's quite easy just to look at the headlines and not understand the historical element. And thank you for deepening and humanizing my understanding of the Sri Lankan crisis. So I'd like to extend a formal vote of thanks.